You hear the footsteps before you see the torches. Heavy, deliberate iron on marble, echoing through corridors that were yours only hours ago. Your hands are still stained with his blood. The silk of your gown clings to your knees, soaked dark where you knelt beside him, where you pressed your palms against wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding, where you watched the light leave his eyes while somewhere in the palace men were already dividing what remained. The chamber door shivers, not from wind, from the weight of armored shoulders testing the bolt from the other side. You know what comes next. Every woman who has ever lived in the shadow of power knows. The question isn't whether they'll come. It's what they'll take when they do. Her name was Aurelia Prisca. She was 26 years old, Empress of Rome, and on the night of March 14th, in the year 193 A.D., she became something else entirely. A hostage in her own palace. A bargaining piece in a game where the players were armed, the rules were unwritten, and the cost of losing was measured in screams that no chronicle would ever record. The man who lay dead on the floor behind her was Didius Gellians, the emperor who had purchased the throne just 66 days earlier in the most grotesque auction Rome had ever witnessed. He had paid the Praetorian Guard 5,000 denarii per soldier for their loyalty. Tonight they had come to collect what gold could never buy. The door explodes inward. Not unlocked, shattered. Splinters of cedar scatter across the tiles like broken teeth. 6 men pour through the opening, their armor still carrying the smell of sweat and iron, and something darker, something she recognizes from the aftermath of battles her husband used to describe. Blood, fresh, not his. Theirs. They have been busy in other parts of the palace first. She sees it in the way they move, the loose confidence of men who have already crossed a line and found no resistance on the other side. No gods struck them down. No senators appeared with scrolls and legal precedents. Just doors that opened when kicked, and people who cowered when threatened, and the dawning realization that for the next 3 days, until the next emperor marches into Rome with his legions, they are the only law that matters. The man who enters last is different. Quintus Aemilius Laetus moves like someone who has been planning this moment for weeks, not improvising it in the chaos. He wears the red cloak of the Praetorian prefect, the second most powerful man in Rome on paper, and on nights like this, the first. His eyes find Aurelia immediately, not with lust, with calculation. He is measuring her the way a merchant measures uncertain goods, determining whether she still holds value, whether she can be useful, whether she knows things he needs, or whether she should simply disappear into the same historical silence that has swallowed every other, inconvenient witness to what happens during the interregnum. Augusta, he says. The title tastes like mockery in his mouth. Your husband is dead. Before we descend into what happened in those next 72 hours, drop a comment and tell me which corner of the world you're watching from. It genuinely amazes me that a story this dark, this buried, still finds its way to people everywhere. She doesn't answer, not because she's paralyzed with grief, because she's counting. 6 guards, 1 prefect. The window behind her is too narrow. The servants' passage was barricaded from the outside hours ago. She heard them dragging furniture, heard the muffled sobbing of her attendants as they realized what was coming. The only door leads through these men. The only way out of this room is to become someone they need alive. The Senate, she says finally, her voice steadier than her hands, will ask questions. Laetus almost smiles. The Senate will receive word that the emperor died of a sudden illness. that in his final moments he named Septimius Severus as his successor, confirming what the legions have already declared. The Senate will vote to affirm this. They will do it quickly. They will do it unanimously, because they understand something you are about to learn. He steps closer, close enough that she can see the dark stain on his breastplate, where someone, some guard or servant or minor official, tried to resist and discovered what resistance costs. For the next 72 hours, Letus says quietly, until Severus arrives with his legions, we hold every gate, every vault, every corridor, every life, including yours. What happens to you depends entirely on how well you understand your situation. This is the machinery that ground Rome's imperial women into dust, not in public executions or formal trials. In the gaps, the spaces between emperors, the hours and days when the men with swords decided who survived the transition and who did not, who kept their dignity and who was stripped of everything, who would be allowed to retire quietly to some distant villa, and who would be found drowned in the Tiber with stones in their pockets. The historians never recorded those hours in detail. They used phrases like, "the transition proceeded smoothly," or "the widow withdrew from public life," as if these were choices, as if there was peace in those words instead of the sound of boots and hallways and doors that wouldn't lock anymore. Aurelia knows what Letus is asking without him saying it directly. Her husband kept records, detailed, damning records, names of senators who had conspired against previous emperors, evidence of corruption in the provinces, lists of officers who had accepted bribes, who had failed in their duties, who had sworn oaths to one man while secretly meeting with emissaries of another. And somewhere in those records, hidden in a place only Didius knew, is proof that could destroy Letus himself, proof that the prefect had been in contact with Severus long before the emperor's death, proof of conspiracy, proof that what happened tonight wasn't improvised violence, but calculated murder. Without those documents, Letus is a hero, the prefect who kept order during a crisis, who ensured a smooth succession, who will be rewarded by the new emperor with gold and titles and continued power. With those documents exposed, he's a traitor, a man who betrayed his oath, who murdered the emperor he was sworn to protect, who should be executed in the most public and humiliating way Roman law allows. I don't know where they are, Aurelia says. It's not entirely a lie. She knows the room. She's seen her husband disappear into his private study for hours, emerging with ink on his fingers and exhaustion in his eyes. She's glimpsed the locked compartments, the hidden drawer behind the false panel in the wall, but she's never opened them herself, never read what was inside. Her husband had been paranoid about who knew what, and with good reason. That paranoia, she realizes now, might be the only reason she's still breathing. Letus studies her face, searching for deception. Behind him, one of the guards shifts his weight. Someone screams in another part of the palace, the sound cutting off abruptly. Aurelia's stomach clenches, but she doesn't let it show. Every display of weakness now is a negotiation lost. "You have until dawn," Letus says finally, "to remember." He signals his men. Two of them move to the doorway, positioning themselves as guards. Not to keep intruders out, to keep Aurelia in. The others follow Letus back into the corridor. Before he leaves, he pauses at the threshold. "Your stepdaughter," he says, almost conversationally. "Claudia. 16, isn't she? Pretty girl. She's in the custody of my officers right now, being asked the same questions you're being asked. How she's treated depends entirely on how cooperative you are. The threat doesn't need elaboration. Aurelia has heard the stories. Every woman in the palace has heard them. What happens to imperial daughters when the guard decides they're no longer protected? What happened to Commodus's concubines after he died? What happened to Pertinax's household when the Praetorians butchered him just 3 months ago? The interregnum is a hunting season, and the women of the fallen regime are the prey. She waits until his footsteps fade. Then she crosses to the window and looks out over the city. Rome sleeps mostly, unaware that the man who bought the throne with gold is already being scrubbed from history, that his widow is being given a deadline measured in hours, that in barracks across the city, soldiers are dividing spoils and deciding which rules still apply and which can be ignored until the next emperor arrives to reimpose them. Aurelia Preca is not a warrior. She was not trained in strategy or combat. She was trained in something else, the politics of survival, the art of making powerful men believe she was useful, harmless, necessary, ignorant. For years she played the role her husband needed, the decorative empress, the woman who attended banquets and smiled at senators and never asked questions about the blood on the marble, or the screams in the dungeons, or the names being quietly erased from monuments. But she listened, she watched. She learned which men could be trusted and which could not, which promises meant something and which were just noises made to buy time, which secrets held power and which were merely embarrassing. She learned that in Rome the most dangerous weapon wasn't a sword, it was knowledge. And right now she has something Letus needs. The question is how to trade it without losing everything else. The night stretches. Hours pass with agonizing slowness. She hears movement throughout the palace, doors being forced open, furniture being overturned, voices raised in anger or fear or pain. At some point, one of the guards brings her water and bread, not from kindness. They need her functional. A corpse can't lead them to hidden archives. Near dawn, footsteps approach again. Different rhythm this time, heavier, more purposeful. The door opens without ceremony, and Letus returns alone. His face is harder now, stripped of the careful neutrality from before. He's been searching. He hasn't found what he needs, the study, he says. Show me. It's not a request. Aurelia rises slowly, letting the motion convey reluctance, calculation, fear, all true, all useful. She proceeds into the corridor, flanked now by guards who barely glance at her, who have seen too much tonight to find one frightened woman interesting. The palace looks different now, violated, tapestries torn down, statues toppled, blood on walls where someone thought running would save them. She steps over a shattered vase that yesterday was priceless. Today is just debris. Her husband's study is exactly as he left it. Scrolls stacked neatly on shelves, tablets arranged by subject. The desk where he signed death warrants and tax reforms and letters to distant governors. Letus sweeps the room with his eyes, seeing the volume of material, calculating how long it would take to read through everything. How many damning secrets might be buried in thousands of pages of correspondence? Where? He demands. Aurelia approaches the far wall. The panel looks like every other panel, seamless wood grain, no visible seam or lock. She knows her husband used his signet ring, a specific pressure point, a mechanism designed by an engineer who was executed immediately after installation to ensure the secret died with him. She still wears Didius's ring on a chain around her neck. She took it from his finger while his body was still warm, knowing it might be the only thing of value she could carry out of this night. She presses the ring against a carved knot in the wood. Nothing happens. Letus tenses behind her. She adjusts the angle slightly, rotates, and the panel clicks. A narrow compartment opens, revealing stacked documents bound in leather cords. Black for Praetorian matters, red for provincial, blue for senatorial, and one unmarked bundle, smaller than the rest, that her husband once told her must never be opened unless he was already dead. Letus reaches for them. Aurelia moves faster, her hand closing around the unmarked bundle before his can. It's a risk, a gamble that he won't simply kill her and take everything. But dead women can't negotiate, and she's betting that the prefect is smart enough to know that some secrets require translation, context, codes that only someone close to the emperor would understand. This one, she says, holding the unmarked papers, contains information about Septimius Severus, about things he did on the frontier that your new emperor would very much prefer stayed buried. Letus freezes. His hand hovers in the air between them, caught between grabbing and listening. Aurelia sees the calculation in his eyes. Severus is marching on Rome with battle-hardened legions, men who worship him, men who have fought under him for years and won victories that made them rich. If Letus hands over information that damages Severus, the new emperor will be grateful, but also wary, wondering what else the prefect knows, wondering if the man who betrayed one emperor might betray another. If Letus destroys the information, he's safe from Severus's wrath, but loses leverage. And if Aurelia is lying, if these papers contain something else entirely, then he's wasted time and possibly his life. What kind of things? He asks carefully. The kind, Aurelia says, that turn heroes into war criminals. The kind that senators use to tear down generals when they get too powerful. The kind that mean the difference between entering Rome in triumph and being declared an enemy of the state. She's exaggerating, probably. She hasn't read the documents. But she remembers her husband's face when he sealed them, the way his hands shook, the whispered conversation with his most trusted advisor about insurance and mutually assured destruction. Whatever is in these papers, it scared Didius Julianus, a man who had lived through purges and civil wars and the reign of Commodus, and still found something in here worth hiding. Letus makes his decision. The stepdaughter, he says. Claudia, she's released to you unharmed. You keep that bundle. I take everything else. When Severus arrives, we both present ourselves as loyal servants who preserved order. You retire quietly to a villa I will provide. You live comfortably. You never speak of this night, and that bundle stays sealed unless one of us needs it. It's not trust, it's a hostage exchange, each of them holding a blade to the other's throat, knowing that striking means dying together. Aurelia recognizes the logic. It's the only logic that functions in the space between emperors where laws dissolve and only leverage remains. Agreed, she says. They stand in the dim study as dawn light begins filtering through the high window. Two people who should be enemies, bound together by secrets that could destroy them both. Letus gathers the marked bundles, evidence he'll use to reward supporters and eliminate rivals, to embed himself so deeply in the new regime that removing him becomes impossible. Aurelia clutches the unmarked papers, a shield, a weapon, a promise that if anyone comes for her again, they'll burn alongside her. 3 days later, Septimius Severus entered Rome. The Praetorian Guard lined the streets in perfect formation, spears polished, armor gleaming, performing loyalty with the precision of men who knew their lives depended on the performance. Severus rode past them without expression. He had already decided what to do with a guard that murdered emperors for profit. He would disband them entirely within the year, replacing them with his own loyal troops. But for now he needed their cooperation, their silence, their testimony that Didius Julianus died of natural causes and named him heir with his final breath. Aurelia Prisca appeared once more in public, dressed in mourning, veiled in black silk. She stood before the Senate and spoke in a voice stripped of emotion, confirming the story, blessing the succession, asking only for permission to retire from public life to honor her grief. The senators, eager to move past the embarrassment of the auctioned throne, granted her request immediately. She left Rome the next morning in a covered wagon, bound for a villa in Campania, where she would live quietly for the rest of her life. History recorded her disappearance in a single line. The widow of Didius Julianus withdrew to private life and was never heard from again. But in the archives of certain families, among documents that were never meant to see daylight, fragments of another story survived. Letters from Quintus Aemilius Letus to unnamed correspondents, carefully worded, always vague, referencing a woman who held information that must be protected at all costs. Orders to specific officers to ensure the villa in Campania was guarded but never entered, that the woman inside was left alone but never forgotten. And one inventory compiled decades later when Aurelia finally died at the age of 53, listing among her possessions a single bundle of documents, unmarked, sealed with wax that had never been broken, buried with her according to instructions she had left with priests who asked no questions because they had been paid extremely well not to. Whatever was in those papers, whatever Didius Julianus had discovered about Septimius Severus, died with Aurelia Prisca. The secret she bought with 3 days of terror in a palace that became a prison. The leverage she carried like a weapon for 27 years, never using it, never needing to, simply letting powerful men know it existed, that she existed, that some witnesses refuse to be silenced even when history pretends they never spoke. The Praetorian Guard would continue murdering emperors for another generation. The interregnum would remain Rome's darkest open secret, the hours when the empire's brutality turned inward and consumed its own. And women like Aurelia would continue disappearing into villas and convents and unmarked graves, carrying stories that no one wanted recorded, holding fragments of truth that were too dangerous to speak and too important to forget. She knelt in her husband's blood and made a choice, not for justice, not for revenge, for survival, for the young girl whose screams she could still hear echoing through empty corridors, for the attendants whose names would never appear in any chronicle, but whose lives hung on her ability to negotiate with killers. She turned horror into leverage, turned 3 days of terror into decades of silence, and when she died, she took with her the proof that Rome's greatest emperors were sometimes also its greatest monsters. That's the cost no history book calculates. The weight carried by the women who lived through transitions and emerged on the other side, intact but changed, alive but hollowed. Aurelia Prisca survived the interregnum, but the version of her that knelt in that blood-soaked chamber, that heard footsteps coming and knew what they meant, that woman didn't make it out. She stayed behind in that room with the shattered door and the broken promises and the terrible knowledge that sometimes survival looks exactly like surrender. The emperor's body was still warm when they came for his wife. By the time it was cold, she had learned to become someone new, someone who could smile at murderers and call it diplomacy, someone who could bury truth and call it wisdom, someone who could live with silence and call it peace. Rome gave her no other options. History gave her no other name. But in the space between what was written and what was endured, Aurelia Prisca built a monument no one could see, a testament carved not in marble, but in the years she lived after surviving what was designed to kill her. Proof that sometimes the greatest act of defiance is simply refusing to disappear.